to Your Healthy Mind Summit. I'm your host, Dr. Kierstin DeWitt, and today I have with me Dr. Radley Ramdhan, teaching us all about PTSD from root causes to branches of healing. Dr. Radley is a naturopathic doctor, licensed acupuncturist, and Army veteran with a passion for working with individuals affected by trauma, helping them identify and resolve unprocessed trauma, and empowering them to past trauma growth. So I am so excited to have Dr. Radley on today to share this extremely important topic and to kind of give us some tips and tools on how we can begin from the root causes to the branches of healing with PTSD. So thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Radley.
Thank you for hosting such a great event, Dr. Kierstin. Definitely looking forward to a great presentation today.
Thank you.
All right. So again, today's topic is PTSD from root causes to branches of healing. And basically what we're going to be going through today, it's sort of an intro to PTSD, trauma, some of the root causes of PTSD, branches of healing, and then post-trauma growth. So what are some types of trauma? There's acute trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma. Acute trauma is basically single incidents that happen. Chronic trauma deals with more repetitive and prolonged type trauma. And then complex trauma, like varied and multiple traumatic events being exposed. So the National Institute of Mental Health defines trauma by saying trauma is classified as a stressful or negative experience. This includes physical or sexual abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, poverty, witnessing distressing events like family or community violence. So within trauma itself, there's 3 E's that has to happen in order for it to be more or less traumatic, right? An event has to happen, you have to go through some type of experience with that event, and then there has to be some type of effect that lasts afterwards that would allow you to develop things like PTSD, anxiety, and any type of post-trauma effects, more or less. So with PTSD, there are 2 major types, simple PTSD and complex PTSD. A lot of the symptoms of PTSD overlap in terms of between simple and complex. But some of the ways that you could sort of define and separate them is that with simple PTSD, it tends to be one or few traumas versus complex PTSD, multiple traumas over an extended period of time. Both types of PTSD shares things like flashbacks, avoidance, hypervigilance, nightmares, sleep disturbance, and emotion dysregulation. So what makes it more of a complex one is the severity of the things that happen. So the nightmares tend to be worse. The chronic insomnia tend to be there. There's more significant sleep disturbances. There's more difficulty with emotional regulation. There's changes in self-perception and distorted perception as a whole. You can see some of those things in simple PTSD, but they typically tend to be more on the milder side. So some of the risk factors associated with PTSD includes things like genetics, anatomical changes in the brain, either through natural development or through different types of injuries, overproduction or lack of production to various types of hormones and brain chemicals. So that's the neuroendocrine and neurochemical factors. There's nutritional deficiencies, such as things like amino acids, vitamins, minerals, anything that support proper brain function or proper production of various types of hormones, neurotransmitters, neurochemicals. When you're nutritionally deficient, it increases your risk of developing PTSD. Then there's the aspect of things like pro-inflammatory condition, environmental toxicity, autoimmunity, compromised immune health, and again, any type of inflammation that would affect brain function. And lastly, but definitely by no means least, exposure to trauma. So you must be exposed to the trauma in order to have post-trauma effects. So one type of trauma that is often overlooked, and the effects of it is often overlooked, is called transgenerational or intergenerational trauma. It's basically the trauma that is passed on from one generation to another. And it could either be passed on through epigenetics, or it could be passed on through the messages that are handed down from generation to generation. So whenever somebody's exposed to trauma, they have to create an adaptive style in order to survive, in order to move on. So there's 4 different types of adaptive styles of survivors. One is victim, the other one's numb, then fighter, and then there's the one that those who made it. So the victims are typically the one who find it difficult to move on. They tend to be emotionally volatile and they tend to be overprotective. So sometimes you see parents who tend to be very overprotective. It's because of their experience, the trauma. They don't want the same thing to happen to their kids, so they tend to be overprotective to their kids as a result of that. The other style is numb, where basically you become emotionally detached. You're intolerant to the weakness in others. So these are the people who you would see that would always seem like they're angry at why it is people don't stand up for themselves. So they would be like, I don't understand why it is that this person can't get out of an abusive relationship, or why can't they fight for themselves, right? So they tend to numb themselves out from any type of emotion, and it's difficult for them to make emotional connection with people. And oftentimes they tend to be very intolerant of that weaknesses that they see in others. The next type is the fighter adaptive style. So this is basically those who need to fight to survive. These are people that you would be seeing that they're always on the edge. They always feel offended by something and they get easily offended. And their first defensive mechanism is that I need to fight this, I need to fight that. Sometimes it's simple things like somebody walk by and brush past them and they feel offended. They don't necessarily think of it as a mistake. They always feel threatened. So first survival mechanism is that I need to fight in order to survive. So it's easy for them to get into fights as a result of that. And then the last one is those who made it. These are basically the ones who move on from the trauma. These are the ones that we should all sort of be aspiring to be. So with the message that is passed down, sometimes there is effects towards the messages that pass down. So looking back to historical things such as Holocaust, slavery, and stuff like that, messages from the survivors from those things are passed on from generation to generation. Their stories are told of how they survived the hard times. And there's something called reparative adaptational impact. So this is basically where the children of these survivors hear the stories of what their parents or grandparents went through. And they develop an overprotectiveness of that parent or grandparent. And through that overprotectiveness, it actually creates sort of a negative response back to the original person who's experienced the trauma, because now those times, like during slavery, during Holocaust, there's that sort of like restricted feeling. When children become overprotective, they create similar type of restrictions. So sometimes even within that, it brings back up some of the trauma that has happened in the past. So with transgenerational trauma, it basically stems, the message that is passed on, the negative message that is usually based off of things like fear, ignorance, confusion, and insecurity. So when we're born without any biases, any prejudice, any type of stereotypes. Then we start socializing with family members, relatives, teachers. We start learning about our norms, values, and expectations in life. Then after that, we start socializing through various types of institution and cultural socialization. So this is where we get a little bit more reinforcement. We get bombardment with messages, sometimes new messages, sometimes the same messages from our first socialization. And this actually sort of forms our conscious and subconscious or unconscious levels of understanding, right? So as we move on, what happens is that the message that is passed on and the message that is received is what would make the difference of whether that transgenerational trauma gets passed on from generation to generation. So something simple to see if you're affected by transgenerational trauma is comparing your parents' patterns to yours. And it's more so looking at negative patterns, because everybody does adapt some type of patterns from their parents, just from being around them long enough, you start adapting certain things. So you want to look at stress responses. How is your parents' stress response in comparison to your stress response? How is your communication styles? What is the community that your parents have around them versus the community that you have around you? In terms of your self-view and your self-care, how does your parents view that? Are they open to self-care? Are they open? How do they hold themselves? Do they hold themselves at a high esteem, or do they keep low self-esteem about themselves? What are their relationship with their parents, and what are your relationship with your parents? And then how does your parents relate to others versus how do you relate to others? Are there patterns that overlap within each of these that are potentially negative patterns that you carry on? So an example that sort of stems from transgenerational trauma is sort of that abuser cycle and oppressor cycle. So the cycle of abuse is basically where you have somebody who was abused, they grow up and they become an abuser. And then you keep creating that cycle over and over until somebody decides to break the cycle. Same thing with the oppressed becoming the oppressor. Sometimes you see people being oppressed, and out of genuine need to fight for equal rights, sometimes they push too much, and then there's people who allow trauma to control them, allow that mental health part of it to control them, and then they go from being oppressed to become an oppressor without even realizing that is what they're doing. So whenever somebody is a victim, be it abused or be it oppressed, there's three options. Some people seek it, some people fight it, and some people try to basically overcome the trauma. So the people who seek it, sometimes you would see cases of where you have somebody who grew up in an abused home, right, where there's domestic violence, they've been abused as a kid. And sometimes within their own relationship, as they grow older, you see that they seek that out in relationship without actually realizing that's what they do. And then they go from, so you would see them leave an abusive relationship and then end up in another abusive relationship. And it's because they seeking it out as something that they felt comfortable with. That's how they seemed norm when they were growing up. So for them, expression of love was inclusive of abuse. So whenever they have or they encounter a relationship without it, they feel like they're missing something, right? So you tend to find that that type of abuser cycle continues because sometimes some people seek it out and they continue staying as a victim. Then there's the ones who try to fight it, and sometimes they fight it so much that they become the abuser, they become the oppressor. And then the ones that overcome it is basically the ones who seek help out. They understand the effects of being the victim and they understand the effects of what it was like for the abuser or the oppressor in that case. So they find that balance in between and they're able to move on. They don't seek it or they don't really fight to oppress somebody else. Okay. So again, this is a little bit expansion on what we had before in terms of the core being fear, ignorance, confusion, and insecurity, right? And the beginning, like I said, you're born into a place where there's no type of information to lead you towards any type of biases. You start socializing with family, friends, relatives, you start learning about things, you start modeling what you want to become your dream. Then you start having that reinforcement of messages through things like churches, schools, television, cultural practices, music, language, media. And then you get the enforcement by these messages being sanctioned, being stigmatized through discrimination and like experiencing it or seeing it firsthand. You have that enforcement of the negative message being passed on. So what happens as a result of these things are things like anger, dehumanization, guilt, collusion, ignorance, self-hatred, stress, crime, violence. You see things like slavery and stuff like that would all be sort of effects like that. And a lot of social injustices would fall into that type of resulting effects of transgenerational trauma. So what do? We have the option to either make a change or we just continue going on with the same cycle. Once we could identify the fear, the ignorance, the confusion, and the insecurity, we could actually make a conscious change towards changing it rather than saying, let's just do nothing and allow the cycle to continue. Because if within our generation, we don't change the biases and the negative stereotypes or the false stereotypes that are there, then we just allow that to be passed on to the next generation. So things you could do is you make a conscious decision to change. You stand up, you interrupt things when you see it going the wrong way. You question the status quo, and then you reframe what the true truth is. So a good example I'm going to use is when I was in college, I had a friend, my roommate actually lived in upstate New York, right? He grew up in a predominantly white area. And when he came to college in Miami, Florida. So going from a predominantly white area to a very diverse area in Miami, Florida, you see some of these things playing out where he came with a lot of perceptions of what life was supposed to be like. And then him coming into Miami, it was a huge culture shock. And talking to him some of the times, initially we got along really well. We've never had a problem as roommates. But one day he came in and he was telling me like some of the things that he understands differently from what he grew up with. And one of the things was that despite me telling him I'm from Trinidad, like I grew up in Trinidad, he never asked or he never seek to find out where Trinidad is. Automatically, because of my skin color, he automatically thought Trinidad is in the Middle East. So it's not until one day he went to class and he came back home and he was like, Radley, I learned something today. And I was like, well, that's kind of the purpose of going to school, right? You're supposed to really learn things every day. So he's like, no, I'm being serious. He's like, I actually learned where Trinidad is. And I was like, so all this time we've been roommates and you really didn't know where Trinidad is? He was like, no, I actually genuinely thought that Trinidad was in the Middle East because he's only met a few people from Trinidad and all of them, it's the same Middle Eastern skin color, right? So his automatic reaction was that everybody that has that skin color is probably from the Middle East, right? So those are the types of things that you see passing on through transgenerational trauma. And it's just a matter of ignorance. Like he didn't know any better, and it's just from him not being exposed to it. So as he went through that time being in college, obviously him being exposed to it is one way of him being able to understand that these stereotypes that we have is not necessarily true. So having that ability to understand it allows you to be able to make those changes. So how do you break that cycle? How do you break the chains of trauma being passed on from generation to generation? The first step is identification of the cycle. Once you could identify what the cycle is, and once you could identify that you're in the cycle, it makes it easy for you to be able to break it. Then there's education. It has to be us and them, not us versus them. And that's one of the big mentality that we have to change. Despite people having differences, it doesn't mean that it has to be us versus them. It should be us and them. Even within the same culture, even within the same village or community, you would always find differences. Even within a family, there's differences. And there's no reason that those differences has to make it us versus them. You could actually appreciate people's differences and work together and still be an us and them, right? Then education about mental health, education about the stigmatization against mental health and removing that sort of stigmatization that we still carry a lot of in terms of mental health. And I guess today with us doing this event and this whole summit is one way to sort of get that stigmatization away from mental health, show that it's normal to be affected by various things from a mental health aspect of it, but it's not necessarily a negative thing. And that is actually one of those transgenerational trauma that is passed on. It's the stigmatization that we carry towards mental health. Then empowerment. So we have to empower ourselves. We have to be our brothers and sisters, keepers, and empower others around us. Take a stance against injustice, become the change, and start working on personal boundaries. So why is it really important to set boundaries? Or what are some of the steps in setting boundaries? First, you have to ask yourself, why do you feel the need to set them? Then ask, how will this specific boundary protect me or this specific aspect of my life, and then establish the consequences of the boundaries if somebody does break the boundaries, and then you communicate both. So you communicate your boundaries and you communicate the consequences for people who break the boundaries. So there are different types of boundaries, and different people classify them differently. So for today's purposes, I like using these 7 different types. So the 7 types I usually talk about, it's the physical, emotional, intellectual, time, material, sexual, or intimacy, and spiritual boundaries. So the physical boundary is basically physical space. Emotional boundary would be your emotions. How do you allow other people to affect your emotions? Are you able to control your emotions when you're around people? How much are you going to allow people around you to influence your emotions? Then the intellectual boundary would be your thoughts and ideas. Are you protective of your thoughts and ideas? Are you willing to share your thoughts and ideas? Your time is a boundary. Who are you spending time? How much time you're spending with them would all play a part in that type of boundary. Then your material boundaries would be your possessions. So, for example, today it's my laptop. Okay? I'm using my laptop to do this presentation today. I'm not going to share my laptop with somebody else. So that's part of like that possession type things. What am I going to share when I'm going to share it? Things that technically belong to us, or we claim to belong to us. And then the sexual intimacy aspect of the boundaries, it's your sexuality, your choices. Who do you have sex with? When do you want to have sex? When you don't want to have sex? And conveying that message about it. A lot of times, even within different cultures, we put a huge stigma towards being open about talking about sex and stuff like that. So even that would include that sexuality boundary. How much are you comfortable talking about it? Who are you comfortable talking about that aspect of your life with? And who do you share that aspect of your life with? And then lastly, the spiritual aspect of boundaries. How do you connect to the bigger world? How do you allow other people to influence your connection to the universe? Different people have different religions. Are you going to create an us versus them type thing, or are you going to be open to understanding other people's religion? Are you going to try to force your way on other people, or allow other people to force their ways onto you without that negative aspect of saying that I'm doing it in order to educate versus I'm doing it to force an unnecessary change, as that case might be. So keeping those types of boundaries is always important, those 7 types. So what sort of boundary do you have? That's something that you have to figure out. And when, how I tell people to think of boundaries is, think of if you build in your home, right? And rain is falling. What do you want from the home to be sort of your protection, right? So if it's raining and you have 4 walls around you and a solid roof, then by no means you're definitely completely protected from anything else. But also what that leaves is that it now blocks you in from receiving other things. So beside rain, when the rain stops, there's sunshine, there's wind, there's other good things that comes after the rain, right? So if you have 4 solid walls, there's no exposure to those good things that comes after the rain, more or less. Then there's the aspect of the loose or porous ones. So this would be an example of, say, again, with the analogy of the house, you have half a roof, 2 walls, and everything else open. When the rain falls, you get wet. You still allow good things to come in after the rain, but when rain's falling, you don't have that proper protection. And then a limited or non-existent boundary would basically be you with just a floor, no walls, no roof, nothing around you to sort of give you any type of protection. And then a healthy boundary would be, you have the walls, you have your roof, but you also include doors and windows. So when the rain's falling, you could close the doors. When the rain stops falling, you could open the doors, allow sunshine to come in, allow people to come in through the doors and stuff like that. So that's the goal. You want to have healthy boundaries where it's not too porous or it's not too rigid. It wants to be somewhere in between, right? So what healthy boundaries should mean to you, right? You want to be able to say yes because you want to and not out of obligation. You want to be guilt-free when saying no. You want to feel self-confident and you want to be empowered whenever there's something going on around you. You want to feel safe and supported. You want to feel that you're in control and you're responsible for your life. And you want to feel in tune with your feelings and emotion and more comfortable expressing them. So once you set healthy boundaries, these are the types of things that would actually be changed, you should be looking for in order to see that your boundaries are actually healthy boundaries. So this is an example of what I like to call a trauma line. There's no, in terms of trauma number 5 with the transgenerational trauma, that could happen at any point in time. But as we grow through life, we experience different types of trauma. During infancy, we experience trauma during childhood times, adolescence, adulthood, and then as we keep growing through life, there's additional trauma, right? So some of the things that could happen during infancy would be things like neglect. It's a simple thing that happens. So a parent or a new parent sometimes doesn't understand how to take care of their kids. Sometimes they neglect the kids. And these small things turn into trauma for that child, especially as they start growing older. Not understanding what attachment is creates sort of like micro traumas as they grow older. Same thing through childhood, adolescence, adulthood. You see reoccurring different types of traumas occurring. So again, another analogy here. I like to think of the effects of trauma as you being a pot and with boiling water. All the past traumas are the cover for the pot, and under the fire would represent all your present traumas and then your future traumas. If the cover doesn't get a chance to come off, the pot eventually, the water inside it's going to boil and build up enough pressure that the past traumas sort of erupts. The pot cover actually comes off because it becomes explosive from that sort of compression, right? So you can't change future trauma. You could control some of your present trauma and you could control the effects that you have from your past trauma. So the goal is always to work on your past trauma and your present trauma. So with the past trauma being less, it means less pressure on top of the pot to hold the boiling water inside. The present trauma, if there's less pressure on top, then you could actually help to release that pressure controlly rather than allowing it to build up to an extent where it becomes explosive. So taking the same analogy and applying it to a real life situation. 2020, right? There was a lot of things like with the Black Lives Movement, and you see a lot of people coming out and speaking out, and even sometimes where you see things like rioting and stuff like that happening. So this is a good example of where that happens, right? A lot of past trauma happened to some of these people that come out and they protest and stuff like that. And then this present trauma, they've never had a chance to deal with those past traumas, be it problems with encounters with police, transgenerational trauma that has been passed on from them, or any other type of trauma that they've experienced prior. And then 2020 happened. We go into lockdown, we go into a pandemic that there's a lot of fear of, and then being enclosed, being in a lockdown sort of gives you that reminder of like what it was like in terms of slavery, what it was like in terms of Holocaust. And the effects of those things that was passed down to us gets that chance to be built up. Now, the pressure from that was never released. So now 2020 comes and that becomes a lot of heat under the pot, right? And that weight on top still there that we keep carrying for all these years. Now we need to become explosive. So how do people react? Sometimes they go into that explosive reaction. You see rioting and you see all of these extremes that comes out. So the goal is really to try to deal with a lot of past traumas so that whenever there's a present trauma and future trauma that comes up, it's not as much pressure that you're already carrying around. It's not an extra weight that you've been carrying around that now creates that chance for building up of internal pressure inside the pot. So how do you move on from there? What are the healing branches towards working with different types of trauma? So there's immediate and there's long-term ways to deal with the trauma. So some of the immediate things that you could do are things like deep breathing exercises, bilateral stimulation, which is basically you could be tapping on, use your right hand to tap on your left hand, use your left hand to tap on your left leg. And the reason for that is because both sides of the brain is controlled by different sides of the body. So sometimes using these simple exercises like tapping could actually allow you to control the way that your brain reacts and give you sort of break you out of that fight or flight response in that moment. Working on mindfulness, things like talk therapy, CBT, EFT, tapping, acupressure, craniosacral therapy, and then in terms of prevention, addressing like potential risk factors. So we've talked about nutritional deficiencies. We've talked about things that affected through genetics, exposure to past traumas and stuff like that. So some of those things, working on those things could actually help prevent you from actually developing PTSD. And then there's more long-term things where it's like behavioral therapy, family, community-based type therapy, art, writing, expressive therapy. Writing therapy was something that I've used for myself, and I've actually used a lot with patients. Art therapy is something that I've also used with patients. Different types of psychotherapy. Then there's the pharmacologics aspect of it, herbal medicine, acupuncture, homeopathy, and then resiliency training and working on post-trauma growth, understanding the effects that your trauma have, and sort of not allowing it to define you, rather allowing you to move on from that. So when a traumatic event happens, what you want to know is whether you're reacting or you're responding, right? And this is where that mindfulness comes in. So the question is, are you in control? Was the action deliberate or impulsive, or were you aware or unaware of what you were doing? So a reaction when something happens is sort of like an explosive thing. It's uncontrolled, it's impulsive, and you're sort of unaware of what you're doing. And a lot of times with that, you could actually result in negative effects from it. A response would be something that is more controlled. It's where you have an actual thought process through it, and it's a deliberate action. You're aware of the choices that you're making. So the goal is that you want to be able to respond rather than react. Another aspect of trauma that you want to focus on is, I know when I came back from deployment, sometimes there's that desire to go back into deployment. You hear it from a lot of different soldiers. We've talked about abuse victims seeking out other type of abusive relationship. So the question is, why is there that desire to reassociate with given traumas? The part of it has to do with that comfort and trauma. You develop a bond with that trauma, and when you don't have that trauma, something feels like it's wrong. So changing that thought process that associates with that is what would be important to sort of break out of that so-called comfort zone. And it happens because sometimes when you're on deployment or when you're in an abusive relationship where you're constantly exposed to that trauma, you feel like that has to become your norm. You adapt a style and basically you become numb to it. So it becomes part of your life, and your only connection to living is really being exposed to those trauma, right? So understanding that sometimes comfort and trauma does happen would be one way to help with moving people forward in terms of their relationship with trauma. So as we mentioned before, there's 3 E's to a trauma, right? The event, then you experience it, and then there's the effects that happen afterwards. So think of the event happening, the experience sort of being like the emotions that is surrounding it, and then the reaction would be sort of like the effects of that traumatic event. So then comes in, here you have something happens and it triggers the event, it triggers the emotion, it triggers the reaction. So the goal for you is to sort of identify the triggers and put in a control plan to stop the triggers from creating such a significant negative emotion or a negative reaction, right? So something I do with patients is sort of help them to be able to identify triggers. So how do I do it? Basically compare a recent event to one of the original events that they could associate, or as early of an event that they could associate with something that you could correlate with the most recent event, right? So first off, you want to correlate the five senses. Think of what you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch or feel in the original event, and then what happened in the recent event. Next, you want to associate emotions. So what type of emotions do you remember from the first event versus what type of emotions do you remember from the most recent event? What types of physical reaction did you experience in the original event versus what type of reaction did you experience with the most recent event? Sometimes within these things, when you see an overlap within them, is what actually could become a trigger. So sometimes the trigger could be associated with a specific scent. So it might be the idea of seeing something. So you could use the example of like, whenever I was on deployment, whenever I see people running, it's a sign of threat, right? When you come back and you go through another event and you see that, say you come back to the US or you come back to wherever home is, and you went through a secondary traumatic event and you see people running within trauma, every time after that, every time you see somebody running, that might trigger sort of a reaction for you. Then same thing happens with sound, same thing happens with smell, taste, touch, and feel. Sometimes an emotion could act as a trigger. So basically, you see somebody that gets you angry, right? And anger was the emotion that you had within the first original event. And then every time anger comes up, you tend to go back into fight or flight. Or sometimes it's a physical reaction. Sometimes something happened and you react a certain way. And then every time that happens, or like say like a panic attack, every time a panic attack comes in, it's difficult for you to come out of that fight or flight event. So once you sort of see that overlap between the original event and the recent event, it's one way to help figure out what the triggers could potentially be. So some of the common trauma triggers that we see is being ignored. So sometimes, again, talking about the childhood aspect of it, during early childhood, maybe the kid was ignored a lot as a kid, and they develop sort of a personality around that. And as they grow older, every time they feel that they're being ignored, it triggers them into this reaction. It may have seemed like a micro trauma when they were kids, but it's actually something that they held on to for a long time. So the effects of it is what is lasting longer than they actually realize. Then being blamed or shamed about something, feeling helpless over a painful situation or injustices that you've witnessed, being judged, criticized, teased, or put down, being rejected by someone or not feeling accepted by someone, especially if it's someone that you care about, someone leaving or threatening to leave us or end a relationship, having too much to do, feeling overwhelmed, or having too much on your plate, loud noises, aggressive sounding noises, exposure, those could be triggers that could bring back up different types of past correlation to trauma, and then not feeling safe in an environment or in a given situation. So these are some of the common things that you see that are overlapping things that happened in an earlier trauma. And then now when you're exposed to it in a secondary and a stressful environment, then it acts as an extra trigger to put you into that fight or flight situation. So once you're able to identify where your trigger is stemming from, you could actually deal with that aspect of that trauma. So a lot of times some patients would come in and they want to focus on a recent trauma. But the thing about it is they focus on the recent trauma. They talk about it, they process that recent trauma. They feel good for a temporary time, and then something else happens and they go back into that same fight of like, sometimes they go back feeling worse than they were before. A lot of times the goal is to find out what is sort of like, I describe it sort of like the magnet, right, towards all your trauma. Try to think of the earliest trauma that happens. The magnet that was the earliest trauma sort of attracts and sort of protects all the earlier trauma. So every new trauma comes, sort of acts like an onion layer on an onion. So every time you peel off a trauma, sometimes there's another layer underneath that you may need to peel off. And not until you get to that core, not until you get to that magnet, is it really most effective sometimes in getting like significant results and sustained results. And again, that goes back to the aspect of the cover on top of the pot. If the cover that's on top of the pot's too heavy, then obviously the pressure inside the pot's going to build up, because it's difficult to say that we're going to continue living in society without being exposed to any type of trauma. So less weight that we carry around from past traumas, less weight that we put on top of the pot, it's easier for you to be able to deal with any uncommon trauma that you may be exposed to. So in moving forward, you want to focus on trigger identification. Like I said, once you're able to identify the triggers, you could put into place a plan to deal with the triggers. You could put in a place that could help you to figure out, okay, if X, Y, and Z is a trigger, what do I do to minimize exposure to the trigger? What do I do to minimize the effects of that specific trigger? Then understanding whether you're reacting versus responding. This is important because think of when you're reacting, you're pretty much losing control. So you're giving away your power. When you're responding, you're in control. So you want to make sure that you have control as you move forward and as you continue to get exposed to variant types of trauma. And then lastly, you want to think of your relation to the trauma. Are you finding comfort in trauma, or are you actually moving on? Are you growing from the trauma that you've been exposed to? So something else that I do with patients is I help them figure out sort of like a crisis plan. Once you've identified your triggers, you could fill the sheet out. So you have your triggers, then you have what are your reactions to the triggers. You figure out ways that you could use to distract yourself. So different types of techniques that you could use, breathing exercises, tapping, calling somebody, whatever the case is. Then you do things like what else could help you to get out of the situation? What could you do to help you feel safe about yourself and your space? Who could you call or reach out to in the case of an emergency? And then you have other resources that you could utilize. So the who could I reach out to in an emergency would be more people that you could be a little bit more dependent on. So it's somebody who you could call and you're more likely to get them to pick up the phone. And other resources would be things like hotline centers or places like those types of things where it's not guaranteed that you're going to get in right away, but it's a resource that you could use more like a long-term aspect of it. And then there's an aspect of goals or plans that you have. So ST is basically short-term, MT is medium-term, and LT is long-term. The reason for having these is because sometimes when you're triggered, and it's good to share it because sometimes when you're in a fight or flight, you lose focus of where you are. You lose your vision. So sometimes knowing that you have goals, knowing that you have plans, and having somebody talk to you about those plans could actually help you break that initial step of when you're in that fight or flight. So sometimes, like you've seen it in movies where a soldier's legs blown off and they start talking about all these different things. It's like, oh, when you go back home, this is what you said you wanted to do. These things actually work because it helps to take you out of that distraction. It actually helps you to distract yourself from that fight or flight. And once you're able to get out fight or flight faster, then the effects of being stuck in fight or flight could potentially be less long-term wise. So that's why it's important to sort of have that crisis plan. Keep it with you, share it with other people around you, especially the people that you would consider sort of those emergency contacts, and especially the goal part, because it's something that they could use to help you sort of break out of going into fight or flight. So some of the things that you want to focus on is that your goal is to find your branch of healing. I mentioned different ways of healing from trauma, right? Not everything that works for you may work for somebody else. So it's the idea of saying, because I did written exposure therapy means everybody else has to do it. It doesn't work that way. It might work for me, but it may not work for somebody else. And that's where understanding that aspect of it allows you to keep searching for your branch of healing. That's what I meant, your branch of healing. What I do with patients is I find things that they like doing and I use those things. So like I said, I've used art therapy and I've used writing. And I've had like even talk therapy I've did with patients. And a lot of it is figuring out what they like, because not everybody is comfortable enough to talk and open up about whatever is going on. I'm going to use myself as an example. When I came back from deployment and I went to the VA and we were doing talk therapy, for me, it's difficult to open up about certain things that were bothering me. So it took me a long time to open up. In an hour session, at the 45, 50-minute mark, I now start feeling comfortable enough to open up about certain things. And at that point, it's usually where the therapist would be like, well, we only have 10 more minutes. This is the point where we need to wrap up. Anything else, we could pick up the next session. Me not being somebody who easily opens up about things, when I go back in for my follow-up appointment, I start all over again. I talk about everything else that is there, but it's the minor aspect of it. And then again, 40 to 50-minute mark, I start opening up about it again. And it's not until one day when I was talking to one of my therapists, I mentioned that I like writing. And she was like, well, there's this new therapy that I just learned about, written exposure therapy. Do you think that is something that you feel you would like to try? And I was like, I'd be willing to try it, because for me, going through school, growing up, whenever there was a stressful period, I always use writing as my sort of getaway from things and sort of as my decompression. So finding something that somebody could relate to and they like doing, it makes it easier for them to be able to express whatever is going on. So once you understand that aspect of it from a doctor's perspective to help your patient, then you have that as a patient taking that opportunity. If you know that there's something that you like doing, finding somebody who utilizes that type of therapy is also important to help you help yourself. And then don't give up on yourself. So not because you go to one type of, or go through one type of therapy and you felt like it didn't help you, don't give up on yourself. Don't say, well, I can't get help because I wasn't able to get help from X, Y, or Z type therapy. And 10 of my friends did the same thing and it worked for them, but it didn't work for me. So again, that's important in finding your branch of healing. Next, don't be defined by a trauma, rather be refined for post-trauma growth. I like using the aspect of diamonds, right? Diamonds have to go through a lot of trauma before they actually look like diamonds, right? So don't be defined by the trauma. Don't be defined by the hardship that you've been through. Rather be refined for the post-trauma growth. Look like the diamond and become the diamond, more or less. And then control your background music and sound effects. Just like in movies that they have these background sounds and music and sound effects and stuff like that. When we carry those past traumas, those things become our background music. Those things become our sound effects. So working on it allows you to change the background music, allows you to change the sound effects. So you have more of a positive thing that you're carrying on rather than a negative heavy weight that you're carrying on with you. And then while I was in school, I had a PTSD patient that I worked with, and she shared this basic quote with me. And it's been with me ever since then. And I felt like it applied to me more after I came back from deployment. And it meant more to me. I understood more of what it meant when I came back and I had to deal with my own aspect of it versus when she was telling me about it. And basically what she said is when you tell your story, two things happen. You could learn from it more about yourself, or someone will listen and learn from it. And this is something I share with patients. This is something I share every time I do sort of like a PTSD presentation, that sometimes it's important to share your story because it would help you be able to understand yourself more. It would be able to help you to be able to identify some of those triggers, identify some of those past traumas that has been going on, identify those core magnets, be able to peel away those layers of onions and stuff like that. And then someone might listen and might learn from it. When you share your experience, sometimes people would understand that the stigma that we carry towards mental health, it shouldn't be there, because a lot of people are affected in that mental health aspect of their life. And because they carry on their stigma, they never actually deal with it. So sometimes sharing your story of what you did and how you overcome whatever it is becomes an empowerment tool for others. And it allows other people to say, yes, you know what? It's not crazy if I ask for help. It's not crazy if I ask for specifically mental health, or I seek any type of mental health support. So again, you get a chance to learn from it, and sometimes somebody would listen and learn from it. So with that, these are my contact information. My email, it's universal3hc@gmail.com. My Twitter, it's Radley M. Ramdhan. Facebook and Instagram are both Universal 3 Health Clinic. So those are basically my contact information.
And thank you so much. And if someone wants to work with you, maybe virtually or in Trinidad, where is email best, or what's the best way to contact?
Email is usually best. You reach out to me by email. I mean, I do use my Instagram and Facebook page. Out of those two, Instagram, I get the notifications from Instagram. For whatever reason, I don't get the notification when somebody sends me a message on Facebook. So it's not until I go in and check the Facebook. So sometimes if I take a little bit of time to respond on Facebook, it's because I didn't get the notification. Mm-hmm. But those are typically like the three best ways to reach me: email, Facebook, or Instagram. I mean, Twitter, it's Twitter. If you want to try to reach there, that's fine. It's also an option. But those are my three main: the email, Facebook, or Instagram. In order of preference, I would say email, Instagram, and then Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, anything else that, and we'll have you for the live Q&A, so I'm sure we'll have many more questions, but anything else that you want to leave us with before we kind of close out for this session?
So first of all, I want to say thanks to you, Dr. DeWitt, for hosting this event. It's a very much needed thing, and especially with the way things are going now, mental health is definitely becoming something more on the forefront. Mm-hmm. And utilizing this event as something to bring the awareness towards it, it's great. In terms of all of our viewers here today, and whenever else viewed in the future, thanks for taking the opportunity to view this. I hope that you do learn something from it. And if I do have to say some of the things that I would like you to take away is that don't underestimate the effects of micro traumas that has been their trail life. I've seen it with patients who say it's just normal and they ignore some of the micro traumas, especially childhood traumas, things like neglect, things like effects from those transgenerational trauma. They come back sort of to haunt you. You carry on, you develop your personal traits and your characteristics around a lot of things that you've been exposed to as a child. And sometimes some of it creates negative effects, then you don't realize that is what it is until somebody points it out to you. And when people point it out to you, you have that opportunity to have that post-trauma growth. And the last thing I want to advise or leave, like I said, with the diamonds, don't let the trauma define you. Let it refine you and become the best you could be after it's all said and done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to learning more at the Q&A. So thank you.